Welcome to the Rightfully Discerning Podcast, where we seek to have intentional and thoughtful conversations about theology and life. We want to walk in truth and grace the way that God designed us to live. So with that said, let's get into this week's podcast. Welcome back to another week. This time, we're doing something a little different, but Leia had a good idea. As we were reading the Chronicles of Narnia, we were starting with The Magician's Nephew, which is the first book, but we were thinking about reading a chapter and then kind of just discussing the theological overlay of what C.S. Lewis usually does with his books. And so, with that said, Leia, would you summarize where we're at? Because we're pretty much at the end of the book and kind of catch everybody up.
Yeah, that's true. You had been out of town for a bit and just our schedule's been crazy, so it's taken us a while to actually read the whole thing, and so we're coming to the end here. If you've never read the book, essentially there's this little boy named Diggory who has an uncle who, as far as he knows, is a little bit crazy, which actually I don't think that ever changes. He is a little bit crazy. Anyway, but he apparently gets a hold of some magic dust, essentially, from another world and makes them into these rings that can transport you to different worlds. And so whenever he does that, the uncle tricks Diggory's friend Polly into putting one of them on and basically has her transported to another world. The catch is he doesn't know where it's going, right? So he just tricks this little girl into going to a universe that he doesn't understand. He hasn't done it himself because, like, it's not safe. I'm an old man. And Diggory confronts him and he's like, "You coward, how on earth could you send a little girl into the unknown? Like, she could be dead for all you know." Because he had sent animals before that point, and so now he had tricked her to go, and then he essentially blackmails Diggory into going and says, like, "Well, someone's got to go get her. It might as well be you. What are you going to tell her mother when she comes looking for her?" Because they've been playing together and now she's missing. Mm-hmm. And so after that point, they end up going to a different world and they go into this like between space where they can move into other worlds besides their own. And so they end up going to this kingdom called Charn, which is where the witch from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Jadis, that's actually where she's from. And so Diggory, like a fool, says, "Hey, let's just go look around a little bit. Let's not go straight home. Let's just go look around." And they go into this world and they find the witch in a hall with a bunch of other people frozen with this bell in the middle that says, I can't remember what it says. It's like, "Strike if you dare," something like that. Mm-hmm. But Polly's like, "This is a bad idea. We need to go." And Diggory is just really, really belligerent about it. In fact, like, grabs Polly's hand because Polly is about to disappear and go back to the woods. She's like, "I'm out of here. This is a bad idea." And he stops her from going and then wakes up the witch by striking the bell. Anyway, so once the witch is awake, you find out pretty quickly that she's not malevolent. What a word? She is malevolent. She isn't benevolent. There we go. Can't find the word. Anyway, but she later confesses, and again, it wasn't something that she's ashamed of, but she declares basically that she killed her entire world because her sister challenged her and she was about to win the war. And so she killed every living thing in her world. And whenever Polly and Diggory get after her for it, or at least try to rebuke her for it, she says, "You don't know. You aren't of the ruling class. You don't know the things that I have to decide. The rules don't apply to me," which is essentially the same thing that Diggory's uncle said whenever he was explaining how he could possibly do something so terrible to Polly. Well, long story short, they end up going back to England with the witch, much to mainly Polly's chagrin. They didn't want to actually take her because they realized pretty quickly that she's horrible. And so she ends up back in England. The uncle thinks that it's just the best thing ever, that he's going to be famous and rich and powerful. She ends up terrorizing England. And as a last-ditch effort, Polly and Diggory catch up to her while she's literally riding on a coach horse and like swinging an iron bar at the people of England, and like the police are trying to get her. And so he lunges out and he grabs her by the heel. Well, unfortunately, the rings work that if you are touching the person who's touching the ring, then you go too. And so Diggory, Polly, the witch, the horse, the cab driver who owned the horse, and Uncle Andrew end up going to like that in-between place, and then they try to take the witch back to her world. But unfortunately, the pools that they have to jump into to get back to different worlds all look the same. And so Diggory and Polly thought that they were taking her back, and they end up taking all of them, including the horse, which the horse is actually the one who kind of got him there because he dipped his nose down into one of the pools. And whenever they get there, it's completely empty. There's no wind, no trees, no grass, no animals, not a sound. They feel something hard underneath them, but it's essentially just like emptiness. And whenever they're there, they start noticing a song, and all of them react differently to the song that's being sung. So Jadis, the witch, she is disgusted by it, but it's more than disgust. It's like just pure hate and disdain for the song. And we later discover that it's a song of creation being sung by this lion, which if you've read any of the other books, you recognize as Aslan from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And so as he sings, he basically breathes the world into creation. So Narnia takes shape, and there's plants and animals and rivers and all of these things. And whenever they are close to the lion, Diggory and Polly want to meet him because they get the sense that obviously this lion must be intelligent, but the witch like throws the metal bar that she's been swinging around in England and tries to kill the lion, because the witch is like supernaturally powerful in terms of like strength and speed. And it just like glances off him and he keeps walking. And so both Andrew and the witch are just terrified of the lion, but eventually Diggory and Polly go to meet him. And one of Diggory's motivations in doing this is he has what do we say, like an unhealthy curiosity, just curious to a fault, which is how he got into this situation in the first place. But it's one of like the first noble impulses, or since him going after Polly, he remembers that his mother is ill and has been failing for a long time to recover. And so he's like, if this lion called everything in this land into existence and made living things, if anyone could help my mother, it'd be him. And someone had like told him about cures from other lands that could work, and even if there were nothing in England or in our world that would be able to help. And so they eventually talk to him. But Aslan, who for all intents and purposes in the world of the Chronicles of Narnia is God, is not having any of Diggory's excuses. And so whenever he comes up to him, he essentially grills Diggory for all of the things that he's done to everyone. So his like selfish intentions originally whenever they were playing, and then waking the witch in the first place and forcing Polly to stay there for it, and all of these different things that he's done. He essentially looks right through Diggory, and Diggory confesses to all of them. And so whenever like all these things are confessed and whatever, Aslan not only agrees to help his mother, but whenever he speaks with Diggory about it, is an interesting way of putting it that I thought was fascinating in terms of how God relates to us. it says, when Diggory looked into the lion's eyes, he saw tears. And for a moment, he was almost sure that the lion was more sorry for his mother being sick than he was. And so you see the compassion in the heart of God in that instance. But rather than just letting his mother be healed that moment, it's more like the blind man in the pool of Siloam situation. He sends him on a mission first, and he has the cabbie horse help him, and then he's like, it's a long way. And Aslan asks him, like, would you like to be a flying horse? And so the horse is like, absolutely, and sprouts wings and flies. And also some of the animals in Narnia, because he does not make human beings in Narnia, he makes animals, and then he calls some to be speaking and thinking animals. And so they end up going to a garden at Aslan's direction to get fruit from a tree. And on the gate to the garden, there was a plaque. And on it, hold up, let me see if I can find it. Oh, here we go. It says, come in by the gold gates, or not at all. Take of my fruit for others, or forbear. For those who steal, or those who climb my wall, shall find their heart's desire, and find despair. And so Diggory enters through the golden gates, and when he's getting the fruit, he remembers that he has the rings in his pocket, and he could just go home right then. He could take the fruit and go, and no one could stop him. But then he remembers the thing on the gate and remembers Aslan being so compassionate about his mother, and he comes to the realization that, no, there is purpose in this quest and why Aslan asked me to do this. And as he's in the garden, he sees the witch, who is just devouring the fruit from this tree. And it's pretty clear that she snuck in. And she loses her mind, basically. She was already crazy, but she becomes like drunk with delusions of grandeur and power. And Aslan has already identified her as being like the first evil to enter Narnia. But he's going to, stay her hand for the time being. And the fruit, even though she thinks that it's, making her strong and making her powerful, it's actually making her lose her senses. And she tries to tempt Diggory into taking the fruit and ruling Narnia with her and all of these things. And for a moment, he believes her. But then she tells him to abandon Polly, leave, and then rule with her, as if Polly didn't even have a ring of her own to travel with. And then it was at that point that he realizes the evil that the witch is trying to persuade him with. A very human evil, right? The selfishness, the pride, the arrogance of wanting power. He even starts in the middle of her monologue to forget his own mother's illness and think of himself. And so they eventually take off and they escape the witch narrowly, which, again, good thing that they stayed out of reach because she is unnaturally strong. They get back to Aslan, and this is about where we left off, Zach and I. And so, without further ado, hopefully, we'll start reading. So it's chapter 14, The Planting of the Tree. Well done, said Aslan, in a voice that made the earth shake. Then Diggory knew that all the Narnians had heard these words, and that the story of them would be handed down from father to son in that new world for hundreds of years and perhaps forever. But he was in no danger of feeling conceited, for he didn't think about it. At all for now, he was face to face with Aslan. This time he found that he could look straight into the lion's eyes. He had forgotten his troubles and felt absolutely content. Well done, son of Adam, said the lion again. For this fruit you have hungered and thirsted and wept. No hand but yours shall sow the seed of the trees, that is, the seed of the tree that is to be the protection of Narnia. Throw the apple toward the river bank, where the ground is soft. Diggory did as he was told, Everyone had grown so quiet that you could hear the soft thump where it fell on the mud. "It is well thrown," said Aslan. "Let us now proceed to the coronation of King Frank of Narnia and Helen, his queen." The children now noticed that the two, for the first time, that they were dressed in strange and beautiful clothes, and their shoulders wore rich robes which flowed out behind them to where 4 dwarfs held up the king's train, and 4 river nymphs, the queen's. Their heads were bare, but Helen had let her hair down, and it made a great improvement in her appearance. But it was neither hair nor clothes that made them look so different from their old selves. Their faces had a new expression, especially the king's. All the sharpness and cunning and quarrelsomeness which he had picked up as a London cabby driver seemed to have been washed away, and the courage and kindness which he had always had were easier to see. Perhaps it was the air of the young world that had done it, or talking with Aslan, or both. "Upon my word," whispered Fledge to Polly, "my old master has been changed nearly as much as I have. Why, he's a real master now." "Yes, but don't buzz in my ear like that," said Polly. It tickles so." "Now," said Aslan, "some of you undo that tangle you have made with those trees, and let us see what we shall find there." Dickory now saw that there were 4 trees growing close together, and their branches had all been bent and laced together or tied together with switches, so as to make a sort of cage. The 2 elephants, with their trunks, and a few dwarves, with their little axes, had soon got it all undone. There were 3 things inside. One was a young tree that seemed to be made of gold. The second was a young tree that seemed to be made of silver. But the third was a miserable object in muddy clothes, sitting hunched up between them. "Gosh," whispered Dickory, "it's Uncle Andrew." To explain all this, we must go back a bit. The beast, you remember, had tried planting and watering him, and when watering him had brought him to his senses, he found himself soaking wet, buried up to his thighs in the earth, which was quickly turning into mud, and surrounded by some wild animals, with more wild animals than he had ever dreamed of in his whole life before. It is perhaps not surprising that he began to scream and howl. This was, in a way, a good thing, for it at last persuaded everyone, even the warthog, that he was in fact alive. So they dug him up again. His trousers were in a real shocking state by now. As soon as his legs were free, he tried to bolt, but one swift curl of the elephant's trunk around his waist put an end to that. Everyone now thought that he must be safely kept somewhere till Aslan had time to come and see him, and say what should be done about him. So they made a sort of cage or coop all around him. They then offered him everything that they could think of to eat. The donkey collected great piles of thistles and threw them in, but Uncle Andrew didn't seem to care about them. The squirrels bombarded him with volleys of nuts, but he only covered his head with his hands and tried to keep out of the way. Birds flew by to and fro, diligently dropping worms on him. And the bear was especially kind. During the afternoon, he found a wild bee's nest, and instead of eating it himself, which he very much would like to have done, this worthy creature brought it back to Uncle Andrew. But this was, in fact, the worst failure of all. The bear lobbed the whole sticky mass over the top of the enclosure, and unfortunately it hit Uncle Andrew slap in the face. Not all the bees were dead. The bear, who would not at all have minded being hit in the face by a honeycomb himself, could not understand why Uncle Andrew staggered back, slipped, and sat down. And it was sheer bad luck that he happened to sat down on the pile of thistles. And anyways, as the warthog said, quite a lot of honey has got into the creature's mouth, and that's bound to have done it some good. They were all really getting quite fond of their strange pet, and hoped that Aslan would allow them to keep it. The cleverer ones were quite sure by now that at least some of the noises which came out of his mouth had a meaning. They christened him Brandy, because he made that noise so often. In the end, however, they had to leave him there for the night. Aslan was busy all that day, instructing the new king and queen, and doing other important things, and could not attend to poor old Brandy. What with the nuts, pears, apples, bananas that had been thrown on to him, he did fairly well for supper, but it wouldn't be true to say that he passed an agreeable night. "Bring out the creature," said Aslan. One of the elephants lifted Uncle Andrew in its trunk and landed him at the lion's feet. He was too frightened to move. "Please, Aslan," said Polly, "could you say something to unfrighten him? And then could you say something to prevent him from ever coming back here again?" "Do you think he wants to?" said Aslan. "Well, Aslan," said Polly, He might send someone else. He's so excited about the bar of the lamppost growing into a lamp tree, and he thinks great folly, child, said Aslan. This world is bursting with life for these few days, because the song with which I called it into life is still hanging in the air, and rumbles in the ground. It will not be so for long. But I cannot tell that to this old sinner. I cannot comfort him either. He has made himself unable to hear my voice. If I spoke to him, he would hear only growlings and roarings. O Adam's sons, how cleverly you defend yourself against all that might do you good. But I will give him the only gift he is still able to receive. And he bowed his great head down rather sadly, and breathed into the magician's terrified face. Sleep, he said. Sleep and be separated for some few hours from all the torments you have devised for yourself. Uncle Andrew immediately rolled over with closed eyes and began breathing peacefully. Carry him aside and lay him down, said Aslan. Now, dwarves, show your smithcraft. Let me see you make 2 crowns for your king and queen. More dwarves than you could dream of rushed forward to the golden tree. They had all its leaves stripped off and some of its branches torn off too, before you could say Jack Robinson. And now the children could see that it did not merely look gold. It was of real soft gold. It had, of course, sprung up from the half-sovereigns which had fallen out of Uncle Andrew's pockets when he had been turned upside down, just as the silver had grown up from the half-crowns. Now, from nowhere, as it seemed, piles of dry brushwood for fuel and a little anvil, hammers, tongs, and bellows were produced. Next moment, how those dwarves loved their work! The fire was blazing, and bellows were roaring, and the gold was melting. The hammers were clinking. 2 moles with whom Aslan had said to dig, which was what they liked best, earlier in the day, poured out a pile of precious stones at the dwarves' feet. Under the clever fingers of the little smiths, 2 crowns took shape, not ugly, heavy things like modern European crowns, but light, delicate, beautifully shaped circles that you could really wear and look nicer by wearing. The king's was set with rubies, and the queen's with emeralds. When the crowns had been cooled in the river, Aslan made Frank and Helen kneel before him, and he placed the crowns on their heads. Then he said, Rise up, king and queen of Narnia, father and mother of many kings that shall be in Narnia and the Isles of Archenland. Be just and merciful and brave. The blessing is upon you. Then everyone cheered, or bayed, or neighed, or trumpeted, or clapped its wings, and the royal pair stood looking solemn and a little shy, but all the nobler for their shyness. And while Diggory was still cheering, he heard the deep voice of Aslan beside him saying, Look. Everyone in the crowd turned its head, and then everyone drew a long breath of wonder and delight. A little way off, towering over their heads, they saw a tree, which had certainly not been there before. It must have grown up silently, yet swiftly, as a flag rises when you pull it up on a flagstaff. While they were all busied about the coronation, its spreading branches seemed to cast a light rather than a shade, and apples peeped out like stars from under every leaf. But it was the smell which came from it, even more than the sight, that made everyone draw in their breath. For a moment, one could hardly think about anything else. Son of Adam, said Aslan, you have sown well, and you, Narnians, let it be your first care to guard this tree, for it is your shield. The witch of whom I told you has fled far to the north of the world. She will live on there, growing stronger in dark magic. But while that tree flourishes, she will never come down into Narnia. She dare not come within 100 miles of the tree, for its smell, which is joy and life and health to you, is death and horror and despair to her. Everyone was staring solemnly at the tree when Aslan suddenly swung his head around, scattering gold gleams of light from his mane as he did so, and fixed his large eyes on the children. What is it, children? He said, for he caught them in the very act of whispering and nudging one another. Oh, Aslan, sir, said Diggory, turning red. I forgot to tell you. The witch has already eaten of those apples, one of the same kind that tree grew from. He hadn't really said all that he was thinking, but Polly said it once for him. Diggory was always much more afraid than she at looking a fool. So we thought, Aslan, she said, that there must be some mistake. She can't really mind the smell of those apples. Why do you think that, daughter of Eve? Asked the lion. Well, she ate one. Child, he replied, that is why all the rest are now a horror to her. That is what happens to those who pluck and eat fruits at the wrong time, and in the wrong way. The fruit is good, but they loathe it ever after. Oh, I see, said Polly. And I suppose because she took it in the wrong way, it won't work for her. I mean, it won't make her always young and all that? Alas, said Aslan, shaking his head. It will. Things always work according to their nature. She has won her heart's desire. She has unwearying strength and endless days, like a goddess. But length of days, with an evil heart, is only length of misery, and already she begins to know it. All get what they want. They do not always like it. I nearly ate one myself, Aslan, said Diggory. Would I? You would, child, said Aslan, for the fruit always works. It must work, but it does not work happily for those who pluck it at their own will. If any Narnian, unbidden, had stolen an apple and planted it here to protect Narnia, it would have protected Narnia. But it would have done so by making Narnia into another strong and cruel empire like Charn, not the kindly land that I meant it to be. And the witch tempted you to do another thing, my son, did she not? Yes, Aslan. She wanted me to take an apple home to my mother. Understand, then, that it would have healed her, but not to your joy or hers. The day would have come when both you and she would have looked back and said it would have been better to die in that illness. And Diggory could say nothing, for tears choked him, and he gave up all hope of saving his mother's life. But at the same time, he knew that the lion knew what would have happened, and that there might be some things more terrible than even losing someone you love by death. But now Aslan was speaking again, almost in a whisper. That is what would have happened, child. With a stolen apple, it is not what will happen now. What I give you now will bring joy. It will not, in your world, give endless life, but it will heal. Go, pluck her an apple from the tree. For a second, Diggory could hardly understand. It was as if the whole world had turned inside out and upside down, and then, like someone in a dream, he was walking across to the tree, and the king and queen were cheering him, and all the creatures were cheering too. He plucked the apple and put it in his pocket. Then he came back to Aslan. Please, he said, may we go home now? He had forgotten to say thank you, but he meant it, and Aslan understood. And that's the end of chapter 14. All right, what do you think?
What do I think?
What do you think?
I don't know. I wasn't here.
Wow.
I disappeared.
Ruining the movie magic.
Yeah, and what about it?
Nothing. Hope your phone call went well.
It was delightful.
Oh, good.
Well, I saw at the beginning it resembled a lot. I just can't find it. For this fruit you have hungered and thirsted and wept. No hand but yours shall sow the seed of the tree that is to be the protection of Narnia. Mainly the first part of that was you've hungered and thirsted.
Yeah.
It reminds me of Psalm something.
Psalm something.
One of the Psalms.
Yep. For this fruit you've hungered and thirsted all your life. But what's interesting is in this chapter he actually gives you an understanding of what it did to the witch, because it's kind of like the old I guess immortality trick.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember now what story it is specifically, but essentially someone wishes for immortality and then it's horrible. Like they live forever. So they watch all their friends die, but they also, even though they live forever, they don't stop aging. And so their body's like riddled with disease, but they won't die.
I don't think I know that one.
I'll have to find it for you, but it's gruesome and fascinating. But in the witch's case, essentially because she plucked the fruit before it was planted in Narnia, what should have produced, long life and, a love for what is good and joyful and true, instead made it that she will live forever, but those things will be death and fear to her. I can't remember exactly what it said. I just read it too, which is really sad. But essentially, it made her averse to all things good, which she already was. But I guess it kind of solidified that, which is kind of what Aslan tells him, is that everyone gets what they want. But it's not always what they think it's going to be.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like whenever she was tempting Diggory to take the fruit to his mother.
Mm-hmm.
Aslan tells him, yeah, it would have like made her live forever. But later on, both you and her would have looked back and said it would have been better for her to die of that illness. And so it's just fascinating to look at how it's done.
There wasn't much else that I can remember that was in that chapter.
No, got nothing?
Mm-mm. Not really.
Yeah. Nothing? Also just kind of fascinating the way that Uncle Andrew responds to Aslan. Because in the first chapter talks about how he doesn't want to believe that the lion is singing. He wants to believe that it's just, roaring or, nonsensical sounds. And so,
He doesn't hear Aslan speaking, just hears the roaring.
Yeah. And so he literally gets to where he can't even hear the words that Aslan's saying. And he tells Dick, he's like, he does not want to hear me. And so even if I were to try to speak comfort to him, all he would be is terrified.
Chapter?
Yeah, it was this chapter. And so it's interesting, like the work he does in the first chapter to like drown it out becomes permanent, which you can definitely see that happening with people who look at, nature, right? Like people who work in the sciences, or a believer, or not even a believer, but like just your average person without a bias one way or the other would say there must be a God, because heaven and earth and creation cry out his existence. And so for them, it leads to salvation, because in like this case, they can hear the voice of God through the things that he's made, which again is Aslan's song making creation. But for those who don't want to hear it, it becomes nonsense. And so you have people like, no, this is just a random empty world.
Yeah. It honestly reminds me of Psalm 10 that I did the whole paper on, that you just helped me with.
Oh, yeah.
It's not the back end. It was the front end. Mainly just man's pride, and, digging their heels into whatever sin that they've committed, and then receiving the praise, and then believing that God has forgiven them because they don't think about it anymore. So it was something along those lines.
Yeah. So essentially it starts off with flattery, where they're like kind of downplaying their bad deeds, and then they just assume that God's already forgiven them, and they just like assume it and then continue doing what they were doing before.
Mm-hmm. And then they elevate themselves continually. It kind of reminds me of that, and just kind of blocking out God. Because the beginning of the psalm starts off with, I'm paraphrasing, "Why, God, do you stand far away from me?"
Yeah. Why are you far off?
Which you can take that one of two ways. You can either take it as it is a time of trial, I guess, and trust in God, and that'll lead you closer to him. Or you can take it the other way, like it explains in the psalm, where you turn away and dig your heels into your pride.
Which I think is exactly what Uncle Andrew was doing, right? In his mind, he's a logical man, which is kind of funny that he takes that route. He's like, no, this animal can't be, wise or sentient. It must be a dumb animal, and I'm going to rule this world and make money from it. even though he literally got there via magic rings.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, really, dude? You seriously?
Like, it's such a weird thing for him to have a qualm with. But I think it's less the ridiculousness of a lion speaking and more...
Authority?
Yeah, the authority. Because Aslan, as we see, like, Aslan is God, right? He's a creator God. And then in other places in the Chronicles, we realize that it's understood that Aslan is God, like how God shows up in Narnia, right? It's how he reveals himself to the creation of Narnia. And so it's not just a lion talking. I think he probably, Uncle Andrew, if he had run into talking animals in other worlds, he probably would have been delighted. Is that he was watching the creator call things into existence, and he hated it.
Yeah,
right?
I didn't want to submit to it.
Well, exactly, because his whole thing earlier is that I'm, above other people, and I can do these things because the rules don't apply to me. And you literally have the rule maker in front of you calling things into existence. And what's interesting is the way that the other people react to Aslan is like awe and worship and surrender. But neither the witch nor Uncle Andrew want that. And so they refuse to listen. Jadis even tries to kill the lion, which is, foolishness, if you know what it is, which she claims to, but she still tries.
Mm-hmm.
Which is kind of like, the devil. Like the devil tried to rebel against God, knowing who God was, even though he knew it wasn't possible to win. He just did it because he wants to rebel.
Yeah.
Essentially.
Didn't want to be under him.
What does it say in Paradise Lost? Better to rule in hell than serve in heaven.
Mm-hmm.
Which again, I said, which again was such a perverse notion. You're really willing to suffer for eternity just for rebellion? Is it worth that much to you? And for some people, apparently it is.
Yeah. It sure can be.
It sure can be.
Anything else in that chapter? I'm trying to recall what happened. Because Uncle Andrew was in his cage and that whole thing happened. They planted the seed.
Oh, the coronation happens.
The coronation?
For the cabbie driver and his wife.
Oh, become the king and queen.
Mm-hmm. Which, again, also kind of fascinating because it says, the land itself changes them, right? So whenever the cabbie, submits to Aslan's rule and he agrees to rule and he's like, but I want my wife with me. It says that they spend time talking and, learning from Aslan. And, the effects of that relationship on them changes their countenance. It says that, the sharpness and harshness of the cabbie driver from being, in London and in that line of work goes away, and the courage and nobility in his character comes forward.
Mm-hmm.
So again, just
the more time you spend with God, the countenance that you gain from the world goes away.
Yep. Again, the effects of God on your character over time, incredible. So good. Because it washes away the influence of the world, and the creator who made your personality, made what you are, knows what it can be in its glorified state, right? And so, as a result, spending time with him, he helps you grow more and more at one into the image, in again, the real world, in the image of Christ. But in doing so, it perfects and brings out all of what you are as well. Just kind of you have someone who's a horrible, catty gossip, right? But that person could also be just deeply in tune with people's needs and being able to help and see their struggle and being able to keep track of what's going on in everyone's life and be there to build them up rather than tear them down. And so you have these natural tendencies, these natural giftings that are submitted to God and become perfected. And you kind of see that happening with the cabbie driver and his wife as they become king and queen in Narnia.
Mm.
Anything else?
I had a thought after you were saying that, but now I lost that thought.
Was it about personalities being perfected?
Oh, it gets rid of the notion that everyone will be the same person if you believe in God and you just become a minion.
Oh, yeah.
Like a robot. It's like, no, we all have different personalities, but it's about the sinful nature that is going away, and you're more like Christ, your God, who is perfect.
Yeah. Which I don't know why not everyone, I guess, but so many people believe that. Like, you just become this automaton whenever you get saved. But, like, there's individuality, which is funny because you even see it in God. God isn't just the Father, this edifice forever and always. He exists in relationship because the members of the Trinity are different in personality, like person generally, but also how they behave and react to things. And those differences are good. All of them are all equally God. And so becoming more Christ-like doesn't diminish your individuality, but rather it just perfects who you are as that individual that God made you.
Mm-hmm. Tunes you into who you're supposed to be.
Mm-hmm. And also who you will be most joyful as.
Mm-hmm. Acting in your gifts makes you the most joyful.
Mm-hmm. Sure does.
I think that's everything from that chapter. Is there anything else from the book that up to that point, since we're doing the entire 14 chapters? You probably kind of covered it all.
I think so. There's also, like, again, I highly recommend going back and reading the book because there's so many good nuggets in there, like so many. Just the way that, like, you have like eternal truth mixed into how these different characters behave is really helpful. And even Diggory, he's kind of like the pilgrim in this story, really, because there's a lot of, I guess, him not trying, but you see him behaving in the selfish, conniving ways that he claims to detest in his uncle, right? So he acts maliciously and, tricking Polly into waking up the witch, and he, like, literally restrains her so he can do it and then keeps her there, like, intentionally putting her in harm's way, which is what he gets after his uncle for. And then whenever he comes face to face with Aslan, he's convicted of it in his soul and he confesses it. So it just kind of shows you kind of the hypocrisy of man, where we see it in someone else and we condemn it and then behave the same way. But hypocrisy can't stand in the face of God because he knows, and he knows we know.
Even if you don't realize it, in that instance.
Mm-hmm. When it's confronted, for sure.
Yeah. A lot of things, to be honest, this happened a lot with me in our marriage. It's like I can see the things in other people. It wasn't until you said some of the things or we talked about them, you're like, oh,
oh, look at that.
I do that. Huh.
I do that.
Well, would you look at there?
I just gotta say, those are always terrible times. There's nothing worse than catching the realization, like, crap, I'm the worst.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, man, not fun.
It is not fun. Anyway, I think that's a good spot. I think we're good.
Are we?
None are good.
There it is.
Not one. Only God. With that, I'll pray.
Sounds good.
Father, thank you for this time we get to spend discussing your word in a story and the analogies within it. I pray that this would be helpful to other people and that you would be able to reach them through these stories, engage their curiosity and wanting to know you, and draw closer to them. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.